Welcome to Why I Left, a podcast that explores the Great Resignation. I'm your host, Brian Aquart. Join me as I chronicle real stories from real people about the reasons they decided to leave their jobs during the pandemic and what has happened since. Hello, and thanks for tuning in to this episode of Why I Left. In today's episode, I chat with Lauren Weber. Lauren is a prominent figure in the world of journalism who has been unraveling the intricacies of the workplace for over a decade. She writes passionately about workforce development, the evolving nature of skills in the job market, and the complex relationships between employers and workers. Her stories, featured in the Wall Street Journal, have captivated readers and offered profound insight into the changing landscape of the workforce, delving into topics that deeply resonate with the core of our podcast's mission. So let's go check out her story. I hope you enjoy it. All right, welcome back. So joining us on Why I Left today is none other than Lauren Weber. She's a skilled reporter from the Wall Street Journal's corporate bureau here in New York. Now, her compelling stories have garnered prestigious awards, and her unique perspective on economic trends and their impact on day-to-day work practices is both enlightening and inspiring. Now, while Lauren didn't leave her job during the pandemic, what I wanted to bring her on is because her expertise and in-depth knowledge on the workforce landscape really make her an invaluable voice to discuss the shifts that have occurred during these transformative times. So I'm very excited to have her on. So hi, Lauren. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So excited to chat with you today, as I mentioned, because, I think there's really nice alignment with the topics that we discuss. Clearly, I'm focused on why people are leaving their jobs during the pandemic and otherwise as the show grows. But, the things that you talk about, everything work related, you and I kind of nerded out a bit when we first met. And so I was like, I definitely have to have you here on the program. So before we talk a little bit about your work, tell us, a little bit about, your upbringing and really how you got into reporting.
So I came to journalism actually a little bit later in life. I didn't really, I didn't work on my high school newspaper or my college newspaper. I was a history and women's studies major in college. After I graduated from school, I moved to Seattle and worked a variety of service jobs, and eventually worked for a small nonprofit organization, thought I was going to go into fundraising or something like that. And then when I moved to New York City, I kind of was ready for a whole change. And I was about 28 years old. And I actually was thinking I was going to go to graduate school for economics. My father is an economist, and I've always been interested in what he does. And over time, I realized I didn't actually want to be an economist, but I wanted to write about economics because I had realized in my, working life in my 20s, working for a nonprofit organization that supported groups doing community organizing around many different issues, including economic justice, I realized that economics, finances, business, employment, all of these things were so fundamental to who we are and to our ability to kind of, make it and to live our lives and live the kinds of lives that we want. So I ended up studying business journalism, got a master's degree in that from Baruch College here in New York City. And then I started a series of reporting jobs, and here I am about 20 years later.
So clearly there, the hook was there, right? And so like you've mentioned, you've been here for over 20 years. Now, what are some of the things, when you think about all that you've covered in these past 20 years, what are some of the things that really keep you going now in the industry?
So I've been at the Wall Street Journal for 12 years. Before that, I had worked at Reuters. I had worked at Newsday on Long Island. I took a couple of years out and wrote a book. That's a whole other lifetime. But now being at the Journal for 12 years, I've been writing about workplace and employment issues for the whole time that I've been there. And I love covering this beat because it's just so universal. Everyone works or has worked. A lot of our readers might be retired, but they have children in the workforce and they're very interested in the issues that affect their kids' working lives. So it's, there's just like already a relatability to the kinds of things that I write about. But within that, I mean, for 12 years, honestly, I go through cycles thinking like, oh my gosh, I've written every single story at least 3 times, whether it's about pay equity or it's about, the overtime, the Department of Labor putting out a new standard for what considered exempt or non-exempt for the salary threshold. And then you have big events like a pandemic that honestly just changed the whole conversation. And the whole purpose of your show, writing about people quitting their jobs, I mean, that just exploded. Now remote work and return to office now. So part of what I love is just this beat kind of renews itself depending on what else is happening in the world. So there's always like a new set of, every time I start to think I might be getting bored, there's always like a new set of issues that becomes really exciting to write about. For a while, like 6 years ago, I did a whole series about the evolution of contingent labor as a business model. So companies were outsourcing more and more of their work, not necessarily offshoring, but outsourcing it to third-party vendors. That was changing the employment relationship for a lot of people. Big companies were employing fewer and fewer of the people who were doing their work. They might be outsourcing the back office. They might be, their security guards and their corporate cafeteria were outsourced a long time ago. So all of these things really changed the structure of work.
No,
And now,
absolutely.
of course, we have a whole new set of trends and issues.
Yeah, no, without a doubt. And the piece especially about how it's like ever evolving. I'm sure you don't get bored on this beat. So there's like a new thing it feels like every week. But specifically,
Mm-hmm.
around the pandemic, right? I want to take you back to March of 2020, and COVID really hits as we're introduced to the pandemic. Before we kind of talk a little bit about the phenomenon that was or is, talk a little bit about how the pandemic affected you.
Oh my gosh. Well, I have a kid. He was 8 years old at the time, and I still remember getting the notice from the New York City School Department of Education saying schools are closing for 5 weeks, or, we're going to go remote for 5 weeks. And I just remember throwing up my hands and thinking, 5 weeks, how are we going to get through this? Like, what do they expect us to do? And at the same time, the Wall Street Journal sent all employees home, right at that same time. It was, I guess, the beginning maybe of the second week of March, or right around March 14th or so.
Mm-hmm.
And, so immediately I'm working remotely. For what I do, I can make a lot of because I'm not my coverage is national in scope. I do a lot of my reporting on the phone. So I could do that from the office or I could do that from home. But I now also had an 8-year-old who needed to figure out like remote school. And it really became about like, oh my gosh, there is no boundary here between that part of my life and my work life. And not only that, but my son needed just a ton of assistance, even just really basic things like he had never really used a computer before. And I gave him my work laptop, and I was using my personal laptop for work. And I mean, those months were just chaos. All, not to mention the level of productivity we were expected and needing to do. There were so many stories we had to write. What about this transition? About the people who were still going to work, doing in-person work, and what were the safety precautions being taken? I mean, there were a million stories that had to be written as soon as as quickly as possible. And I'm part of a team, so the work is spread out. But still, like I was basically working like 16 or 17 hours a day, partly because I was working in, I'd have maybe an hour of uninterrupted time. And then I had to make lunch for my son and, help him with school. And then I'd go back and do calls for an hour. And then I actually wrote a first person essay called My New Office is a Bunk Bed, because I like my son also just couldn't sit still and like do what he needed to do unless I was in the room. So I just set up in his bedroom and I had my phone with me, all my headphones, I had my computer, and I was on the bottom bunk of his bunk bed while he was like at his little desk doing his second grade assignments. So it was chaos. It was also very rewarding because there were just so many important stories and so many people had experiences that you know everybody's life was in chaos,
No, without a
and so it
doubt.
was very rewarding to be able to write about some of what people were experiencing.
No, I bet. And the pandemic brought about what we know now is like this whole great resignation phenomenon, right? Many
Mhm.
employees, they were starting to reevaluate their career choices and maybe exit, right? What insights can you share from your reporting on why people decided to leave their jobs during this time?
Well, it was interesting because I remember watching the data. So, the Labor Department every month puts out the job openings, layoffs, and turnover data, the JOLTS data. And I would be watching that, and it just the number of people quitting was inching up. Usually was around, like, I think pre-pandemic it was around 2.3% of US workers would like quit their jobs every month. A lot of that is just very normal churn. People find a better job, or the churn is very healthy for the economy. People are finding better fits for their skills, for their interests. You want to have a fair amount of that. But the numbers were going up. And I remember there was one month where it might have hit like 2.8% or 3%. And I wrote a story about that. We'd already been hearing about this. This was probably in the spring of 2021. And, as you know, right after the pandemic hit, lots of people lost their jobs. A
Mhm.
lot of people were furloughed, laid off. And the big fear was, oh my gosh, like we're going to have massive unemployment. Then things start picking up and it just went very quickly. Companies all of a sudden needed, uh, you know, servers, they needed, airlines needed pilots and flight attendants to come back. Um, Manufacturers were getting people back online, or like we're staffing up because all of a sudden we had all these shortages of toilet paper and everything else.
Right.
Um, so it just went like insanely fast from huge layoffs to massive hiring up. And companies couldn't hire people quickly enough. So that also meant they were poaching from other places. So, there were a lot of things going on. I mean, as you know, and I'm sure you've had guests on talking about all of them, some of it was wages were just getting bid up and up and up because companies were desperate. So it was really easy, especially if you were making $14 as a home care worker and then somebody offers you $14.50 or $15. A lot of people were job hopping because they just got a slightly better opportunity
Mhm.
and needed to make, wanted to make more money. Also, a lot of companies were offering like sign-on bonuses. So it's like, oh, great, I'll leave my, warehouse job here and get the $3,000 sign-on bonus to go somewhere else. Or for nurses, a $5,000 sign-on bonus. Um, and then also there was just that whole reconsideration of what is my life going to look like now? And from for people who had been working office jobs and or went remote, a lot of people were like, I kind of like being at home and having more time with my family, and maybe I don't want to have this job that's like demanding so many hours of my time, and so I'm going to take some time off. I heard from a lot of people doing that. We're driving across the country in an RV for 3 months. I actually did hear a lot of those
I
stories.
saw a lot of those.
uh yeah. Or, I'm going to work part time and my kids' school is still not back in session and I can't have a full time job anymore. And, so there were many, many reasons, some driven by the labor shortages that were meant that, you know, there were incentives to quit your job and go somewhere else, and some just from people downshifting.
Yeah. And, that's been one of the fascinating things for me as I've, continued these conversations around having people having that much time to themselves, especially for the office workers who ended up going remote. There's rare occasions in life where we can all point to this collective massive humanity going through one thing at the same time. And that time starts giving some folks, opportunities, like thinking differently, like, well, what is going on here, right? And what am I actually doing? And so I like to hear that those are some of the things you were hearing as well, because those are some things that are coming out in my show too. Absolutely. So, one of the things that's been interesting when we think about work as a whole is like workforce development, right? This has become kind of this critical aspect when we talk about preparing for this future of work. What are some, in your reporting and some of the things that you're covering now, what are some innovative approaches or maybe even success stories that you've come across that really address this evolving like skill requirement that folks are needing in today's job market?
Yeah, that is really fascinating. I spend a lot of my time thinking about that and trying to figure out what are the right stories to write about that issue. Partly because we are just facing long-term labor shortages. We've had kind of a very unpredictable, uncertain economy for a while, and yet the unemployment rate still stays. I think right now we're at 3.8%, historically very, very low. Um, so and that's partly demographics, baby boomers retiring. A lot of people left prematurely during the pandemic. Some came back, some didn't. Um, Low birth rate, a lot of that, very unpredictable, unreliable immigration policies. So part of it is we just don't have enough people participating in the labor market and coming into the labor force. Um, and then part of it too is like, how do you make sure the people who are in the workforce have the right skills? Um, and um, that is a really tough one. I hear people saying I can find um, an MBA analyst for those jobs that I have, but I cannot find enough production workers, or I cannot find enough maintenance technicians, depending on what kind of industry somebody's in. But so a lot of the shortages that I hear about are in skilled trades. Um, and I don't think we have a great solution for that yet. Part of it is because people have been told for now probably a few decades the only way to have a secure lifestyle is to get a college degree. Um, so part of what ends up happening is you have a lot of people go to college but don't finish it, either because they can't afford it, or um, maybe that was just never the right path for them. But we need better pathways for people to get into sustainable, like family sustaining jobs that are not necessarily college pathways. Um, so I see like very innovative projects from companies or from community colleges or nonprofit organizations and intermediaries that are really all about training maybe people without college degrees for the jobs of the future. And that's not necessarily not just like maintenance technicians, it's also like data analysis, and obviously more and more it's about AI and making sure you have people who can do um, who can do all kinds of jobs where you're going to be working alongside some kind of AI augmentation or enablement, and being able to understand how to do that. I think we're still waiting to see what exactly those occupations are.
Yeah, and it's actually a great point. And sometimes bring it up on the show, but in my day to day work, I'm in the healthcare space, and we're actually working on a few things that speak to exactly what you were just mentioning around how do we, you talk about creating pathways for folks, in our specific case, pathways to healthcare, because not everybody is going to go to college for a lot of the reasons you mentioned, either affordability or truthfully maybe lack of desire. But there's still an opportunity for them to make these family sustaining, life sustaining wages, especially here in New York. And we've come up with a couple, partnerships that are happening across the city that we're hoping to be a little slice of trying to address that. So I'm glad that is something you're seeing at a broader scale too. It's this model of apprenticeships too. I think is gaining a bit more traction nationally. Definitely big overseas, but here it was more so big in like the trade space. But you're starting to see it
Hmm.
more in like finance, business, tech, and even healthcare. So that's promising that you're noticing it as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really exciting possibility.
Yeah.
Hard to scale in a lot
Yes.
of ways,
Yeah.
but yeah, even it just takes like each employer kind of making a commitment.
Yep, absolutely. One of the things that we've seen an uptick in is around the whole gig economy, right? And contingent work arrangements are really things that have been kind of on the rise. When you see this happening at a larger scale, what are your thoughts on like some of the potential benefits and maybe pitfalls for workers who work in this type of relationship?
Right. I think those opportunities are great for, I guess some people call it fractional income. So you need to make a little more money to meet your bills or to, you know, pay for the vacation you really want to take next year or um, save for a specific um purchase. Maybe you want to save for a down payment and so you drive for Uber or Lyft on your weekends. Um, I think where there's a problem is when people are trying to make a full-time living at these gig jobs because you don't get the health and you don't get health insurance and for most of them you have no protections as a worker, the kinds of protections that you get as a W-2 employee thanks to the Fair Labor Standards Act and you know you get overtime pay for hours that you work over 40 hours a week. You get unemployment. You have access to unemployment insurance if you lose your job. There are so many. Um, you're protected by anti-discrimination statutes. There are so many protections you get when you have an employer and you are their employee that you don't get if you're self-employed or an independent contractor. So there are definitely benefits again in people having sort of that option to make extra income, but like I said, I think it's hard to make a living that way if that's your sole source of income.
No, definitely.
Obviously not, I think for the contingent workforce, if when you move up the skill level, if you're like a high priced consultant, obviously a lot of people make a very good living as
Yeah.
you know at being self-employed or as independent contractors. But I think when we talk about the bigger numbers, it's often these jobs that are not so great.
No, definitely. One of the things you mentioned earlier was around how folks were really job hopping for maybe 50 cents more, a dollar more, things like that. And often when I think about this, having formerly been in HR and in that space, engagement, workplace culture, obviously it plays a crucial role in like retaining talent, right? And there's this huge war for talent even now. When you look at your research, what are some maybe standout practices that foster this positive or a more inclusive work environment that really help companies keep employees there?
I mean, I think a lot of it falls under this question of trust. And this has come up so much with a lot of the return to office policies is like, does my employer trust me to figure out how to get my work done in the way that makes the most sense for me? Um, so I think that's a big piece of it. And that doesn't mean like everybody should have access or needs to have access to remote work or like total flexibility in your hours, but I think there are the companies where people are treated like children who have to be overseen and heavily managed in order to get their work done. I think those companies tend to not have great cultures and probably experience more turnover. I think another reason that quitting declined, like now we're at kind of pre-pandemic levels of people quitting their jobs back to around 2.3%, is that a lot of jobs actually did get better because of the pandemic, like they pay better. I mean,
Right.
granted, we have also had high inflation. So even if you got a 5% raise, you may not still have kept up with inflation. But so I think pay improved, and the data show that pay improves the most for people at the lower end of the wage scale, uh, where they need it most, where real increases in wages had been lagging for many years. not even keeping pace with inflation. So that's good news. And so yeah, pay went up, and I think a lot of companies, smart companies, added more benefits. I think the number of companies offering paid sick time has gone up,
Yes.
or various kinds of, added to different kinds of leave, or made it possible to use your sick days to care for dependents. Smart companies, I think, improved their benefits packages. And I think that's another reason why people are now more likely to stay put. It's also
Yeah.
that there is less hiring going on, although the job numbers every month continue to be stronger than anybody expects. So
Yeah. No,
it's a weird
it
time.
is. No, it definitely is. It definitely is. I wanted to talk a little bit about an article that I recently read of yours where you talk about the rise and fall of the chief diversity officers, right? And in it, you talk a lot, and I've seen a lot of literature on this where, how politically divided the work environment has become, especially, Supreme Court came down with that ruling, right? And who knows how that's going to play out in the workplace. But it's really in response to efforts around diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, all those things. What advice would you offer to aspiring either chief diversity officers or folks who are interested in going into this space to help them navigate the complexities and really stay resilient in trying to pursue work in that space for their respective organizations?
This has been a really fascinating area to cover. I mean, as long as I've been writing about workplace issues, but especially in the last few months, or a little bit longer than that, partly because of the Supreme Court decision on affirmative action. This is a really tough area for companies to do well, I think. And I think being a chief diversity officer, or being on a DEI team, is really, really hard. Um, I spoke to one chief diversity officer a couple of years ago, before, I think this was shortly after George Floyd was murdered, and I did a story about CDOs. And this person said, "You're being asked to fix hundreds of years of history in a year or two." Um, and that's one reason why he was saying there's a lot of turnover here, is because, like, you're brought in with huge expectations that you're going to fix all kinds of unconscious bias and conscious bias, and improve representation numbers for gender and race and religion and sexual orientation, and you're basically given a year or two to do it. And if you don't, then the executive team is disappointed in you. And you know um that's partly why a lot of people either leave or get pushed out. Now, the Supreme Court decision, I think, adds a whole other layer to that, um where companies are now really scared about about being assertive in their equity programs. Mainly, I mean, diversity, equity, and inclusion is three separate but related things. But I think the issue, as one person explained it to me, the issue often comes up around the equity programs, which are like, we are going to do a women's leadership development program, or we have an apprenticeship or fellowship program for underserved racial and ethnic groups. Those are the kinds of places where I think companies are pulling back the most. So it's still fine to source, open your sourcing and try to source from more places, have ERGs, employee resource groups, and things. But oh God, I'm not really getting to the advice part of your
No, it's
question.
okay.
But I think all of these things are complicating factors, and for people who are in this field, um, I I mean, I, I I don't know that I have much advice, other than I think people who are good at this job tend to be people who are very comfortable in discomfort.
Mm.
A chief diversity officer I interviewed, who was very inspiring, said that to me. Like, I was asking her about the skill set here, and she said, you have to be very comfortable in discomfort, or with discomfort. And I think that is so true, because if you actually want to have impact in these jobs, you have to be prepared to have, like, really uncomfortable conversations with people, whether it's your executive team or rank and file or managers. Often the managers are where the rubber meets the road on things. So yeah,
Yeah.
get comfortable with
No,
discomfort.
absolutely. Yeah, no, and truthfully, I think that's great advice, and also probably another one is get comfortable with a lack of resources because I see often
Yes.
in some of the articles that I've seen come out around how look, these folks are put in these roles, so to not only add on the time barrier that's likely placed on them, but there's also a lack of additional resources that they receive, and
Mm-hmm.
more often than not, that's not their primary role. Like for some of the folks kind of get pulled into the DEI space as an aside to whatever their day to day is
Mm-hmm.
supposed to be. So that makes
Mm-hmm.
sense.
So true. Yeah. So probably like be very targeted in what you want to accomplish and think you can accomplish.
Exactly. You know,
Yeah.
in your reporting, have you come across any notable examples of companies successfully navigating economic downturns while prioritizing the well-being of their employees?
That's a very good question. I mean, companies have very different attitudes or approaches to a downturn. Some will do whatever they can to hold on to people, and see layoffs as, last resort. I think most companies probably feel that way, and partly because of the human cost, but also because it just is bad for morale. It's bad for the people who stay, and didn't lose their jobs. It's You get bad press often for layoffs. Um, so I mean, I think, we're at a period where people just really want a lot of communication and transparency. Transparency is a big keyword in the workplace. And I think, another thing that often comes up is, authenticity.
Mm-hmm.
So leaders who can communicate authentically and well, I think people get very freaked out when they don't know what's happening. So I think kind of prioritizing communication is always a good idea. I think, there's such an interesting conversation happening now about employee voice and employee empowerment. And you see it in a lot of the labor actions that have been going on, not just the, traditional union activity like the strikes in at the car makers, but also, what's the organizing at Starbucks and other places. Um, a lot of the newer organizing activity comes around this idea of employee empowerment and voice. And that also comes a little bit out of the pandemic where people felt like they had more leverage in the workplace. And so I think people also people want to be included and want to feel somewhat entitled to knowing what's happening and being part of decisions that affect them.
No, without a doubt. Yeah, that's actually in my day to day work. That's actually one of the questions, right, folks? Do you feel like involved in the decisions that affect your work? Is it actual like survey question? So I do
Right.
think that that's
And
truthfully
what is
important.
yeah, and what is the right amount of that? Like
Yeah,
you can't get things done if everybody has a say in
right.
everything.
Yeah,
So I
definitely.
think one of the really hard things right now for managers and for leaders is like trying to figure out what is the appropriate amount of like top down versus bottom up or, consensus style decision making.
Yeah.
Um yeah, because you still need to get everything done.
No, definitely. And as we talked a little bit about this earlier, but as we kind of move into, and really hopefully more companies start to embrace this remote and hybrid work models, despite some of the tension we see there, but how can businesses really maintain a sense of camaraderie and team spirit among folks who may be physically distant?
That is so hard. I've heard everything from we pay once a quarter for everybody to get together in one location.
Mm.
That's got to be expensive at a certain
Yeah.
point. To, we do like a Zoom happy hour once a week. I think people got really burnt out on Zoom happy hours
Yeah,
early in the pandemic.
definitely.
Yeah, I think it is much easier for the people who've been in a place for a while. Like I think about my colleagues who joined the journal right before or during the pandemic, and it's a totally different experience. They just didn't have that team building, you know, sense early on.
Mhm.
Whereas those of us who already had really strong relationships with coworkers when the pandemic happened, we were able to keep those going by, you meet up with somebody in the park and go for a walk, or, just kind of staying in touch with friends, coworker friends. Um, but yeah, how to like create that kind of from scratch. I do really think I am a believer that people do need to be together sometimes.
Mhm.
Um, maybe not everybody, but the people who want to do that. I think one thing that we've recognized during the pandemic is people have very different work styles. So for
Yes.
some people, they just are going to they're going to do their best work when they have as little to do with other people as possible. And other people do their best work when they're with others. I don't know how as an organization you manage that, because it's can be subtle. People don't always know. Managers can't necessarily account for that. But again, I think this partly comes down to the trust issue, is like, let people figure out how they work best.
No, I completely agree with that as well. And so now looking ahead, um, you're in this space, you're seeing a lot of the trends in work. What do you see as some of the most significant trends shaping the future of work?
Well, of course, AI. We still don't really know how that is going to shape anything. I know, you know, most organizations are experimenting with it and trying to figure it out. And we've written stories about the fact that, like, big companies anyway, generally have like created a task force or assigned one person to be responsible for what is our AI strategy and which processes does it make sense to, buy some AI tools that we can incorporate into what we do. Um, I think that will change a lot of people's work. Like, I imagine for myself, 10 years from now or 5 years from now, I probably won't be writing the first drafts of my stories. I will still be coming up with the ideas, I'll still be doing the interviews, but I might be using AI to crawl for research, find research and data for me to use. And I might be asking it to write my first drafts. And then, maybe I will edit those. So AI is one. Um, I think the labor shortage is just massive. Like, it will have huge impacts, and I think it's the kind of thing that's sort of like the frog in boiling water. If you put the frog in boiling water, it'll try to jump out, but if you put it in cold water and slowly heat it up, it will stay. I think we are the frog, and it's getting worse and worse. And I think a lot of people haven't fully recognized that this is here to stay. It's not just temporary. So how do you expand how do you tap untapped pools of talent? I think some of those might be older workers. Some of it is people with disabilities. um, how do you have a rational immigration policy? I mean, I've had a whole bunch of people email me and say, why can't I hire undocumented workers? Like, we have this migrant crisis in big cities, including New York City. Why can't I hire some of those people and put them to work? Because I can't find enough people. Um, and the answer is they can't hire them. Like,
Right, right,
they're not allowed to hire them.
right.
Um, and it's also I hate to say this is very economist language, but like optimizing human capital. How do you find people who are underutilized or underemployed in the jobs they have because they haven't been given access and opportunity, and get them on a path where they are going to use their potential, and fulfill their potential. So, there are a lot of companies that have programs like, how do we figure out who in our frontline staff can be trained for management positions or can be trained to become a data analyst, or one of the jobs that we have to fill because of how the workplace is changing.
Oh, no, I love that. Those are things that last one specifically around potential like reskilling of employees and or upskilling, I should say, is going to be very intriguing. And obviously the AI world is going to be
Hmm.
fascinating on how that evolves. Um, so
Yeah.
so now,
And
oh, sorry,
AI
go
can
ahead.
help with that. So
Oh yeah, definitely. That's the
so we should
beautiful
figure
thing.
out how it can help with that. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And I love the fact that you're open that, look, it could write my first draft, right? Like it could definitely do that. And then you kind of edit from there because it's been helpful for me when I think about some of the podcast things that I do. Like truthfully don't want to write all of my show notes, right? I don't want to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I can prompt it in a way that helps me flesh that out, but then put my own voice on it. And so to your point, like those are things that I'm doing now specifically for the show. And it's been such a time saver. Now, granted, it's, I no longer need someone to write my show notes. And so I guess that sucks for them on Fiverr, but it works out for me because, I can kind of flow. My workflow is a bit easier now.
Mm-hmm. So did AI write the questions that you've been asking me?
No, it didn't. Sometimes what I do is, because when I prompt things, what's funny? I should probably do that. I should probably do a little bit more of that because I look at everyone's like background and then I go in sometimes kind of painstakingly thinking like, oh, well, what questions could I ask them? I think I've had it write some, not for this one, but I think I should probably, it depends on where it kind of flows. And if I'm in like that, you have to be in the AI mindset, right? Like I don't think about it often. But now that you mention it, I should probably think about it more because that could also help with my workflow. So thank you for that. So one aspect of season 3 I like to recently included is a question for me, right? So when you think about, and it could be anything you'd like, but what's one question you have for me that I could potentially answer either about the show, future work, anything?
Well, you are on the ground doing employment and workforce work. What is the thing you struggle with most?
There is at times struggle with like professionally.
Yeah, what is like the workforce problem that you most wish you could solve?
Oh, that's a great question. I think the biggest thing that I wish I could solve now is a mixture of the shortages in some of the healthcare space, right? Some of the things I'm involved with is I'm trying to help create a pipeline to help facilitate to maybe plug some of those shortages that we anticipate. But I wish that there were ways that we could give. I'll give one example that we could plant a seed in some students to say that, hey, there are certain careers that you really should be focused on like right now, right? Like right now. And obviously this is going to sound very biased and selfish, but like the lab, right? And for people who are interested in becoming like lab techs, that is a great career to get into right now, right? If you think you're not going to go to college, that's okay. Come be a lab tech. Come be a medical assistant. Come do that because one of our premises is that once you get into especially a system like ours, which is very huge, once you get into the system, the world is really your oyster. So the biggest challenge for me is getting young people to really truthfully understand the vast opportunities that exist in healthcare, right? People want to, and granted, yes, doctors and nurses, clearly that's a thing in healthcare. But when folks are like, oh, I want to do, I'm interested in tech, or I'm interested in finance, or I'm interested in logistics or supply chain, you can do that here, right? You could do that at a place, like an organization that I work at. And so it's the challenge for me, I would say, and probably a lot of others in my space, is how do we plant that seed now in like the high school, middle schoolers to say, hey, you can come and do this here. And there is so much opportunity for you. So that's, and then truthfully, that's some of the things that I'm working on currently. But it's about how do we shift that mindset? And there were a couple of programs that I was I'm leading and continue to lead where you actually saw that learning and that shift happen. And so that's how I kind of know like we're on the right path because it's about exposure, right? They have to see what's available. And then you start connecting the dots. Here's the classes. Hey, I don't know if I want to go to school, but I at least want to try to make some money to do. Well, here's what you can do. And you know what? You can come and make some money part-time and, we'll maybe help you out where you can work on your associates or work on your bachelor's and then come in and get an elevated role. So you mentioned something about like family sustaining, life sustaining wages. we offer that. And so those are the programs that I've truthfully, gained a strong affinity for, because I've been able to see the impact that it could make on an individual and potentially their family.
That was great. I think you're right. So much of it is about exposure. So how do you expose people to the jobs that are available out there?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Lauren, this was great. I loved having you on the show. Glad we connected. At that dinner in the city. A big shout out to Dave Wilkin for connecting us over that dinner with 10KC, and would love for you to share where our listeners can find you and support some of the work that you do.
Sure. So you can subscribe to the Wall Street Journal, or I'm on Twitter, or now X, at Lauren Weber WSJ. I'm also on LinkedIn, so feel free to connect with me there. And I do post my stories often there. And my email address is lauren.weber@wsj.com. And I'm always open to hearing story ideas and hearing about real people's experiences in the workplace if they have ideas they think I should write about.
No, I love that. I love that. So thank you for that info. And look, that'll do it for today's episode. Again, I want to thank Lauren Weber for joining us. I'll be sure to share her information and all the places that you can find her in our show notes. And I hope you all have a great week, and we'll definitely see you next time. Lauren, thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Have a good one.
Thanks again for listening to Why I Left. Be sure to join us next time for more stories from the Great Resignation. Visit us at www.whyileft.co. That's whyileft.co. And subscribe to the show on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.